Hello, everyone. I'm Harvey Cohen, Chair of the Selection Committee for the Bussey Research Awards. On behalf of the Selection Committee, I'm pleased to introduce the awardees for the 22nd International Congress of Gerontology. These awards were created with an endowment from Gerontology International in honor of Dr. Ewald W. Bussey, President of the IAGG from 1985 to 1989, and the awards have been presented at every Congress since 1993. The endowment and selection process is administered by the Duke Center for the Study of Aging and Human Development. The purpose of these awards is to recognize the achievements of late junior to mid-career scientists and to encourage their continued contributions to aging research. There are 2 awards presented at each Congress. One award recognizes an investigator from the social and behavioral sciences, and the other award recognizes an investigator from the biomedical sciences. We would welcome nominations for awards to be presented at the 23rd International Congress, so keep an eye on the IAGG website or the Duke Aging Center website about 2 years before that meeting. Following this introduction, each awardee will present an approximately 25-minute talk describing their work. The Biomedical Sciences awardee is Dr. Claudia SUEMOTO, Associate Professor of Geriatrics at the University of Sao Paulo Medical School and coordinator of the Brazilian Biobank for Aging Studies. The Social and Behavioral Sciences awardee is Dr. Dawn C. CARR, Associate Professor of Sociology and Director of the Claude Pepper Center at Florida State University. Congratulations to both awardees, and I am certain that you will enjoy their presentations.
Hello, it's an honor for me to be here, and today I'm going to present our work on dementia in low and middle income countries. So the outline of this presentation, I'm going to give some background on dementia in these countries and then talk specifically about our work on dementia etiology, risk factors, and prevention. So nowadays, more than half of the people with dementia already live in low and middle income countries. And this number is expected to rise in 2015 in a way that more than 70% of people with dementia will live in countries like Brazil, low middle income countries. And among all the regions in the world, I would like to emphasize that Latin America seems to be particularly vulnerable, has the larger prevalence of dementia happens in Latin America, where it's estimated that more than 80% of the people, that older people have dementia. And why it's so common to have dementia in low and middle income countries? Probably due to high cerebral vulnerability in these countries that is caused by low socioeconomic factors, mainly low education, and also the high prevalence of cardiovascular risk factors. And not only it's very common, what makes things more worrisome is the fact that dementia can start earlier in these countries, on average 10 years earlier, bringing a larger burden for the healthcare systems and also for the population of low and middle income countries. And it's also important to think in a very geriatric way about cognitive function. Cognitive function is something that is building during life, and it can be maintaining also starting in middle age and also in older life. So there are many windows of opportunities to intervene and have a better cognition. So the cognitive function starts in the intrauterine phase, and since birth until the 3rd decade of life, there is a progressive gain of cognitive function. And this cognitive gain can be very heterogeneous depending on how stimulating is the environment that this child is raised. And after during middle age and also in older age, there is a progressive decline in cognitive function that can be very subtle depending on the conditions, but if something happens, for example, like a stroke, you can have a very acute loss of cognitive function. So first of all, I would like to bring some work that we've been doing in dementia and etiology. I work with the Biobanking for Aging Studies that is located in the city of São Paulo. São Paulo is the largest city in Brazil. Almost 15 million of people who live here. And for example, in 2016, we have more than 86,000 deaths. Of those, around 14,000 went through full body autopsy. And why autopsy is so common in the city of São Paulo? Because all the deaths that happens without medical assistance or the cause of the death is not known during life, autopsy is mandatory to determine the cause of life. So this has happening since the 90s. But since 2004, we start asking the family members of the deceased to donate the brain for studies. And since 2004, we have built the largest brain bank in Latin America. Nowadays, we have more than 5,000 samples of brains, of donors, in fact. And from those, around 1,500 have full neuropathology evaluation. Using immunohistochemistry and also classical histology, we determine the presence of Alzheimer's disease through the classification of the red plaques and neurofibrillary tangles. We also determine the presence of vascular dementia through the evaluation of hyalin atherosclerosis, lacunar infarct, and amyloid angiopathy. We see the presence of Lewy body disease through the identification of alpha-synuclein protein, and more recently we have looking for the LAT disease that is characterized by the presence of the TDP43 protein. So in this work that was published in 2017, we show data from more than 1,000 participants of the Biobank for Aging Studies. The mean age was 74. We have an equal distribution between genders. And one of the characteristics of all the samples here in Brazil is that we are highly admixed. 69% of our sample is white, but then later I'm going to show that we have a large proportion of participants that are black or admixed. Another characteristic of our studies is that we have lower education compared to high-income countries. The mean education in the brain bank is only 4 years. And we have a high frequency of cardiovascular risk factors. For example, around 6% of the sample have had hypertension and 29% had diabetes. One of the characteristics of our brain bank that is different from other countries that have more advanced dementia cases is that 60% of our cases have normal cognition at time of death, and the other 40% have different degrees of cognitive impairment. This table we show the socio-demographic and clinical characteristics of the participants regarding their cognitive status. As expected, people with dementia are older and more female than the other groups. They have lower education and also they have a higher prevalence of stroke and a lower body mass index. Participants with dementia in our sample were declared more frequent use alcohol in the past, and as expected too, they have a higher prevalence of ApoE allele 4. The next step that we did is to see among groups what was the lesions that were associated with dementia. All of them that we investigated were associated except for a gyrophilic brain disease. And then we built a multivariate model, including all these variables and seeing the association with dementia. And the ones that were associated with dementia in an independent way were neurofibrillary tangles evaluated by the Braak stage. Mainly the more advanced Braak stages were associated with very high risk of dementia, as well as a hippocampal sclerosis, lacunar infarcts, hyalin atherosclerosis, pseudocalcinosis, and advanced stages of Braak stage for Parkinson's disease. Another find that we saw was that among people that have normal cognition, we have almost 25% of them with asymptomatic brain lesions. severe enough to secure one of these neuropathology diagnoses. This is really something that has been described previously. In our sample, almost 1/4 of them have enough neuropathology to secure a diagnosis. Another thing that called our attention was that although Alzheimer's disease was the most frequent cause of dementia, accounting for half of the cases, vascular dementia was really common. 35% of the diagnosis was related to vascular dementia, that here is represented by the red color, mainly in participants that have questionable dementia or even mild, moderate, or severe dementia. This raises our attention because although different from neurodegenerative disease, vascular dementia is something that can be preventable. Another study that I would like to highlight is the one that we did comparing the neuropathology in the very old group, defined by those that have 8 years or older at time of death compared to younger participants. When we compared the two age groups, very old participants were more female, has less education, more cognitive impairment, less coronary disease, less dyslipidemia at time of the death. And I think this is more related to survival bias, in fact. The very old participants have lower BMI and have higher frequency of never being a smoker or had used alcohol. So the first take-home message is that in the very old group, they have a very high frequency of neuropathology. Almost 70% of them have one neuropathologic diagnosis, very, very common. And this was significantly different from the younger participants. And not only the neuropathologies are common, but it's very frequent to have 2 or more associated neuropathologies. You can see this in this graphic. In the white bars, we see here that they have very, it's much more common to see 2 or more neuropathology in the very old group. In fact, the frequency of 2 or more neuropathologies in the younger participants was 22% compared to 45% in the very old group, which gives then 2.7 higher odds of 2 or more neuropathologies in those that were 8 years or older compared to the younger participants. And it has been described that although the neuropathological lesions are very common in the very old group, sometimes the association of these neuropathologies with cognitive functions is attenuated. This has been described in other samples from high-income countries showing attenuation of the association between ID neuropathology and cognition. We didn't find this here, but we find an attenuation of lacunar infarcts with cognition. Although they are very common in very old people, the association with cognition was weaker compared to younger participants. On the other hand, we found a more strong association between TDP-43 and cognitive function in older participants than in those that were younger than 8 years old. And this is in line with the LAT entity. That is something that has been described that more and more has been an important cause of cognitive impairment in older adults. I'd like to move on and talk a little bit about risk factors for dementia using our data here in Brazil. So as I told you before, we have a very admixed population, and we compared here in this first graph what people declared there, they are being like white or non-white, and the African ancestry measure my genetics. And what's really interesting in that is that even among the people that was declared as white, a large amount of them has more than 20% of African ancestry in their genetic background. So here, that is really hard to determine the ancestry only based on appearance. And one thing that this paper showed is that the association between neuropathological lesions and ancestry is attenuated. It's less frequent to have neuritic plaques in people with higher African ancestry, suggesting that maybe there is something that could be related to biological backgrounds for the occurrence of neuropathology in different ancestries. We did a follow-up study that is currently under review. With time, we increased our sample size and we isolated only people with normal cognition or RD neuropathology, and showed that among those with higher burden of both neuritic plaques and neurofibrillary tangles, we have a worse cognitive function as we increase the amount of after ancestry, only among those that have high burden of neuropathology. Also raising some questions about different effects of genetic risk factors among different ancestries. And we are currently finishing up this study to publish. Another thing that is also important regarding social demographic and race ethnicity is the association of cognitive reserve in low and middle income countries. Usually samples from high income countries, they have higher education. On average, they have 12 to 16 years of education. Here, as I showed to you, the average education is only 4 years. And in fact, almost 25% of our sample has 0 years of education. And also they have a very high frequency of unskilled jobs. This is really common in our sample. So one study that we just published this year is the association between education and cognitive function, that we found that even few years of education was associated with a better cognition compared to people that are illiterate, that had no formal education. Having 1 to 4 years was protective, as far as having 5 or more, and there was a dose increase in protection has been increased education. On the other hand, we didn't find any association with occupation, but I have to highlight that we have a very high frequency of unskilled occupations and very low frequency of skilled participants in our sample that could have interfered. Although this kind of lack of association has been described in other studies, not with neuropathologic studies, but in clinical studies. And it's important to highlight that in this last model, we also adjusted for the presence of neuropathology. So anything that links education with cognitive function is independent of the presence of lesions and probably is a surrogate marker of cognitive reserve. Another data set that I've been working in the last years, it is longitudinal study of adult health. This is a cohort study that has been going on since 2008, 2010. They already have 3 waves of evaluation that happen on average 4 years apart. They include more than 15,000 participants that were enrolling in 6 different centers in Brazil. And they have very cool measures. Besides having questionnaires, they have like objective measures like ultrasounds, ankle brachial index, electrocardiogram, anthropometric measures. And we have been investigating some of these factors also in this sample. This is the work from Laís Bertola that was published last year. And we wanted to investigate the association of socioeconomic status and cognition. And we did this through the evaluation of 3 measures, a composite measure of early socioeconomic status, education, and also a composite measure of late socioeconomic status. And we saw that all of these were related to better cognition if you have better measures. Most of the path, we use path analysis to analyze that. Most of the association happens through the path of early life science, education, and cognition, but there is also an indirect effect through late life science and a direct effect of early science too. Moving on to cardiovascular risk factors is another thing that brings a high vulnerability to dementia in our settings. We have, this is another study about the association of ideal cardiovascular health and cognition, the ELSE study. The American Heart Association have this metrics that they call Life Simple 7, where they offer 7 measures of ideal cardiovascular health involving smoking, physical activity, cholesterol levels, blood pressure, diet, BMI, and also blood sugar. And among participants of the ELSA study, we have 53% of them, they have poor cardiovascular health, meaning that they have 0 or 1 or 2 ideal factors, and only 80% of the sample has optimal cardiovascular health. When we compare these three groups regarding cognition, the group with poor cardiovascular health had worse global cognition and also worse performance in every cognitive domain, showing there is a lot of room for improvement regarding cardiovascular health in Brazil. And coming back to autopsy studies, we have been investigating a lot of the association between systemic atherosclerosis and dementia too. And this is one study that I did earlier in my career, where we measure atherosclerosis in more than 700 participants. We measure their plaque size and also their intermediate thickness, and compare that with dementia, and found that left internal carotid artery stenosis was related to a higher odds of dementia. We replicated this study in the ELSA Brazil study. Here, we used carotid intermediate thickness measured by ultrasound, and showed an association of this measure with poor motor performance, and also with coronary artery calcification and poor executive function, highlighting the possible association between systemic atherosclerosis and worse cognitive function and dementia. Another study done by Sara Menezes with the ELSA study showed the association of hypertension and cognitive decline. During visit 1 and 2 of the ELSA Brazil study, she evaluated more than 7,000 participants and saw a lot of measures related to hypertension, and found that hypertension and pre-hypertension levels were related to a faster cognitive decline, regardless of duration of hypertension, and the control of hypertension predicted a reduced pace of cognitive decline. We have also showed the association between postural hypotension and hypertension with poor cognitive performance. And this was particularly worse in participants that have postural hypotension, but didn't have the expected increase in heart rate that should happen when you have postural changes. The last study that we have been working on is the Brazilian longitudinal study of aging, that's called ELSA Brazil. It is a health and retirement study, sister study. This is a survey that has been replicated in various countries around the world, and it's also happening in Brazil. They evaluated in 2015-16 more than 9,000 people aged 50 years or older, and the cool thing is that they are representative of the Brazilian population. In this work, Dr. Aliberti saw the association between hypertension and cognition, but we seek also for the interaction between frailty and hypertension on the association with cognition. And we show that in people that are younger than 65 years old, we have the expected association of worse cognition in the presence of hypertension. But in older participants, the presence of frail had an interaction with the exposure, meaning that in older participants with frail, higher levels of arterial pressure related to better cognition. And I would like to finish talking about dementia prevention. I think most of you are aware of the work of Professor Jill Livingstone in the Lancet Commission paper, showing that 40% of cases of dementia are attributable to 12 risk factors. And this is a classic figure showing the life course association of these 12 risk factors with cognitive function later in life. And together with Professor Jill Livingstone and Nahid Mukadam from the UK group, and under the coordination of Professor Claudia, we replicated this study in Brazil using the ELSA Brazil data, and showed that in Brazil, the potential prevention of these 12 factors is higher. 48% of cases of dementia in Brazil are related to these 12 risk factors. One thing that called our attention is that when we examine this association by race, the amount of prevention is almost the same, but the risk factors, the importance of risk factors vary between white and Black people. While hypertension is the most important risk factor in white people, in Black people, the most important factor is lower education in life, followed by hypertension and hearing loss, suggesting that the interventions for dementia prevention should be tailored regarding the composition of the population that's going to be targeted. And to end, I think most of you are also aware about the work from Professor Mia Kivupeto from the Karolinska Institute. She did the finger study that was published in 2015. It's a randomized clinical study with a multi-domain intervention to prevent dementia. And this has expanded to the worldwide fingers, meaning that a lot of countries in the world are implementing the finger intervention. And we are also doing this in Latin America, but the difference is that we are a multi-center study. We have 12 countries working together. We already started last year enrolling participants, and we expected to implement and investigate the effects of fingers intervention in 1,200 participants from Latin America. And I would like to end thanking all the people that have been working with me during the last years. Also, I would like to thank a lot all the funding opportunities from the Brazilian institutionals, and including also the international funding that we have from Alzheimer's Association. So thank you so much, and I hope to see you soon.
Hi, my name is Dawn CARR. I'll be giving a presentation about my research in response to the BUSSY Mid-Career Award. And today I'm going to give a little bit of a background on myself, some of the work that I've done so far, and a little bit of background about how I'm thinking about my next steps. So with an opportunity like this to talk about my work to date, I thought it was important to acknowledge just some of the many people that have played an important role in my career. There are more than what you see here, but it's just a reminder that any of the work that I talk about today is not due to my own experiences and my own work alone. My success is our success, that with all my colleagues. And I think that all the steps I've taken have been a direct consequence of having wonderful mentors, guides in different forms. I've had wonderful people who have helped to give me support in all different phases of my career, even today, and students who have had an incredible impact on my life. So as I talk about all of the things that have occurred to date, I want to make sure that it's clear that all of this is not related to my own work, but that of the community of scholars that I'm lucky enough to be a part of. So I thought it would be helpful to just give a little bit of a background on myself and kind of where I started. And I'll come back around to this later on. So my training in gerontology was at Miami University. I have a master's in gerontological studies and a PhD in social gerontology. And that training was important in lots of ways in setting the stage for what I've done subsequently. Not only because I had interdisciplinary research training, different kinds of social science researchers provided such incredible background to help me understand what is possible in the field of gerontology. But the Scripps Gerontology Center was also a really important foundational opportunity for me. The Scripps Gerontology Center, I think, is one of the most outstanding research centers for studying the applied aspects of aging, figuring out ways to make a difference and figure out how to improve social programs. And the team of scholars there that helped train me set the stage for being able to be attuned to ways to make older adults' lives better. It also gave me incredible training in evaluation research. I then went on to UNC Chapel Hill as a postdoc at the Institute on Aging there, and for the first time really became immersed in public health priorities and got lots of training on, let's say, more traditional academic avenues, working with large data sets and population research. And those things really provided the first steps in my career and helped me ask some of the most foundational questions that set me on my first path in gerontology. So the first thing I noticed as a student that kind of has set up my career was a critical orientation to what I would call the stereotype of the life course structure. And so that looks something like this, where we see that people sort of think of their lives in three buckets. They start off with education, they go on to have kind of a period of work and family, and then they move into retirement. Sometimes this is called the sort of tripart life course, as Riley called it. But often we think about this as being a relatively short period of time in retirement, with the majority of our life really kind of occurring prior to retirement. But the part that people often think about is this very last section of life, and they study the period that is really at the very end, the place where things are difficult and health starts to decline. And in those last maybe 2 to 5 years, when we need to be paying attention to long-term care and lots of other issues. But what we often miss, and I think is more reflective today, is the more complex ways that we move in and through different life phases. And today, we have a much lengthier period of retirement. And rather than just focusing on those last couple of years and kind of viewing all the stuff that came before it in a kind of a singular sort of orientation, it's, I think, more helpful to be thinking in terms of the period of the life course as we move in and through retirement and slowly make our way into periods where we have some financial setbacks, but we have a lot of recovery too. And there's variation in these lengths, but we have longer lives and we have more complex trajectories. In terms of gerontology, what I noticed is that a lot of times people weren't paying as much attention to the period that happened before that unhealthy period. And there's a growing sort of consensus that we do need to be thinking about later life as different phases. And this first period of the third age being the period where we're mostly retired and still healthy, and the fourth age being the period where some physical setbacks start to occur, or disability starts to occur, cognitive or physical. So the third age period is what really caught my attention as a student, and I became very interested in trying to understand this period of the third age, which I felt had not received very much attention. So my first kind of major research question that guided the foundation of my career was really about this third age. How did it emerge, and what were the implications for gerontology? So my dissertation looked at this from a demographic standpoint, trying to understand, is the third age a real thing? And what does that look like? And I will only show you this graphic here, which was a demographic projection that was looking at the expected percent of the life course that is spent or expected to be spent of remaining life in the third age. So this is a measure that I created, and what I found was that this third age life expectancy at age 60 for the average person was about 17 years. So giving approximately 17 years of life that someone could still expect at age 60 to live in a period of healthy retirement. And I also observed lots of disparities based on race and gender. So there was quite a bit of variation, but at the end of the day, what I sort of showed was that there was a standardized period of the third age that wasn't just for some people, but on average occurred for all people across race and gender. This led me to work on a book, an edited volume with a colleague. And this book kind of set the stage to try to initiate or encourage gerontologists to pay attention to this third age period a little more carefully. And it provided some background on theory, methods, and themes and controversies about the third age. And my goal was to figure out an agenda for social gerontologists. But really, in the end, what I was doing was setting up an agenda for myself and the next phases of sort of my career. So after I went through my training, my first career transition was moving to Stanford University at the Stanford Center on Longevity, working at what is in many ways an academic think tank. And what this opportunity provided during the 4 years I was there was to really immerse myself in understanding how to translate gerontological knowledge to policymakers, to for-profit companies and not-for-profit companies, and even to the general public. And what really drove me while I was here was thinking about the factors that promote a longer and higher quality third age. And so thinking about a lot of the agenda that I sort of identified with this edited volume that I worked with people in Europe and across the United States, really starting to hone in what are the key features of a third age that we need to be paying attention to if we want to sort of increase the number of years or maintain a healthy period of later life. And what I came to was that social and productive engagement was an area that was profound in terms of its effect on a long and third age period of the life course. And I became very interested in social and productive engagement issues. So this work that I did really set me on a path to digging into the health and retirement study. And this data set has provided a huge foundation for a lot of the work that I've done. So I thought it would be helpful just to bring attention to it. It's a very well-known data set in the United States, and it's one of the longest running longitudinal studies of adults 50 and older funded by the National Institutes of Health. Began in 1992. It runs every 2 years with some smaller studies in between, and it's right around 20,000 people in every wave, with new cohorts added over time. So this is one of the most useful data sets due to its comprehensive set of questions and longitudinal nature for studying health and aging processes. So this became a really useful tool for me to ask a lot of the questions that guided the next steps in my career. So as I was thinking about trying to understand the benefits of social and productive engagement and how it affected different outcomes in later life, I came to identify some really key methodological challenges that I had to tackle. One is that when we're looking at healthy social and productive engagement, it's very clear that healthier people are much more likely to engage in different kinds of behaviors, including social and productive activities. So this issue of selection becomes a potential barrier for being able to figure out whether the behavior itself is actually leading to a good outcome, or if it's just healthy people engaging in behaviors that may or may not be making them even healthier. In addition to that, there's often issues of lifestyle behaviors accumulating over time in their effect. So often when we look at aging, we're looking at a single point in time, and it's possible that the benefits accumulate over an extended period of time, not just in later life. So being able to acknowledge this life course sort of effects or more longer term effects of these behaviors. And then finally, the mechanisms that drive the benefits are often most visible when you're not just looking at the behavior, but really when we're evaluating moments where there are some different transitions in people's lives. And so paying attention to figure out when a person might expect to recover or kind of handle a certain transitions, it can be helpful to see whether these effects are occurring in a more beneficial sort of way. And so these are the methodological challenges I tried to tackle in this period of my research. So I thought I'd talk about just a couple of examples here. One is a project that really was guided by 3 questions. The first was whether initiating a new volunteer role reduced disability in later life. And volunteering has been a centerpiece of a lot of the work that I've done over the years. And this particular set of questions is often something that I've wrestled with. How do we best look at this? Can we figure out if volunteering is beneficial? And so this study focused on new volunteers, so individuals who didn't have a history of volunteering, who started a new volunteer role. And so first, we're looking at whether starting a new volunteer was beneficial, whether there was an intensity difference, so how much volunteering mattered, and whether the benefits differed based on gender. And so just briefly, this study was designed by looking first at non-volunteers who had this history of not volunteering, and then looking over time to see if they did start volunteering, whether or not they had better physical health outcomes. So this study looked at functional limitations and looked at changes in functional limitations before and then after potentially starting a new volunteer role. So what I found in this study was, in fact, controlling for selection into these different volunteer intensity levels. What I found was indeed that not only is volunteering associated with improvements in physical health benefits, but also that higher levels was associated with better or higher levels of benefits. So there's few increases in disabilities for those engaging in the higher levels, net of selection into volunteering relative to those who didn't take on a new volunteer role. But this was very much dependent on gender. For women, any amount of volunteering was similarly beneficial and protective, and women do accumulate more physical disabilities as they age relative to men. And for men, there wasn't a significant benefit except for those who engaged in the highest level of volunteering. So intensity matters and was dependent on gender. Another example I looked at was related to this very important period of life that often is common in later life, which is widowhood. So volunteering, in addition to being beneficial to health, has also been shown to be, or argued to be, beneficial for promoting social engagement. You volunteer and you talk to people and get to know new people. So I was interested in learning whether starting a new role influenced loneliness among those who had become a widow or a widower. And a similar study design here, I looked at people who are continuously married, some of whom went on to become widowed, and then I examined whether or not starting a new volunteer role had an influence on loneliness for those who became widowed relative to their married counterparts. And what I found in the far left bar are the people who are continuously married, and there's no difference in their level of loneliness over time for those continuously married. But for those who became widowed, they experienced substantially higher levels of loneliness unless they volunteered at what is about the equivalent of 4 hours a week on average. And these are people starting a new volunteer role. So this notion of sort of seeing a transition into volunteering seemed to have this unique protective effect also on people in terms of their mental health at a period that is quite stressful. So after my time at Stanford, I moved to Florida State University, where I am now in the Department of Sociology and at the Pepper Institute on Aging and Public Policy. And here, I began to focus more on these stressors. I became more interested in these stressors because I was interested in figuring out if there were ways to kind of avoid setbacks so that when people are experiencing these stressors, that's sort of figuring out what factors led some people to be more likely to have an accelerated onset of the fourth age where they experience these substantial declines, and what factors might protect them. And this led me to work with colleagues to dig into this research on resilience, which is an area that has become increasingly interesting to me in this phase of my career. So we know that lots of major setbacks do occur as we age. So by the time we're in later life, we're much more likely to experience different types of setbacks like widowhood. And some people do better than others. Just like we saw with volunteering, some people seem to recover better in terms of their loneliness than others. but figuring out what factors kind of prevent them from experiencing poor outcomes could be related to other factors. And so psychological resilience is something that I became interested in because it has been shown to be related to responses to stressors. And there's different key domains that capture this characteristic of what it, the measure of what it means to be resilient includes. And these tend to include issues like perseverance, flexibility, meaning and purpose, self-reliance, and then something that's often called existential aloneness, which is the sense that you can handle things and you have to take on things yourself sometimes. So there were several major gaps in the literature with this particular area of study that I wanted to particularly dig into. One is it's really difficult to measure resilience. So in order to be able to look at the different someone's capacity to respond to a stressor, it's important to have a measure that can capture that ability. And there hasn't been any major longitudinal study on aging that had a measure that did that. In addition to that, there's a correlation between good outcomes and resilience. So we've seen some evidence that resilience can be measured with it as an individual characteristic or trait, but there haven't been very many studies that have actually looked at resilience over time, certainly not in later life. So this was an area of particular interest. And so my colleagues and I, in 2016, introduced a study that used a measure that is available in the HRS now that we developed from different items there in their psychosocial questionnaire. And we were able to piece together a measure of resilience and subsequently have done lots of research using this measure and showing that it's a very solid measure in terms of how it functions in ways that we would expect and is associated with lots of different aging outcomes. So there were 12 items in this measure, and you're welcome to read about it. We're really interested in how this measure has been able to better understand aging issues. One thing we looked at with my colleague here at FSU was how resilience kind of matched up to other very common measures with regard to different health outcomes. And this is an example of one particular outcome, but what you can see here is that resilience actually provided a more potent protective effect on health than other measures that we often think about, like mastery and optimism and hopefulness, which is kind of the inverse of hopelessness. And we looked at that, and our research shows net of all kinds of selection issues and controlling for all the things we would expect would predict someone to be more resilient, like all the resources that help support people, we still find resilience is predictive of functional, psychological, cognitive, and self-rated health benefits. So the last project I'll talk about here is related to this resilience study. And more recent research that we've been doing is paying attention to understanding resilience with regard to one particular major stressor, and that's COVID-19, this recent pandemic. So this is actually ongoing work that we're really digging into now on resilience. And we are interested in increasingly financial hardships. And this was common at the beginning of the pandemic. Lots of people started facing substantial setbacks due to the shutting down of different jobs and other things. So we found that it was very common actually for people to experience financial setbacks. And we're interested to see how that affected their psychological well-being and whether resilience might play a role. And just really briefly, what we found is that people who experienced major financial hardships were much more likely to experience increases in psychological issues, specifically here, depressive symptoms in the period pre versus post COVID, with post-COVID being measured in 2020. And however, this was dependent on level of resilience. So those with the highest level of hardships, 3 or more, experienced less increase in depressive symptoms when they had higher levels of resilience. It never completely made them look like someone who didn't have any hardships, but it did attenuate those effects substantially. So as I'm looking into this final section, I've just recently been appointed the director of the Claude Pepper Center here at FSU, which is a new phase of my career that I'm just getting started in. And as I move into this phase, I'm reflecting a lot on the early phase of my career where I was trained and thinking more about not just these traditional kind of studies and understanding how the third age emerged and what kinds of things predict the third age and are protective, but trying to take that information that we've learned and figure out ways to more directly tackle some of these problems. And so I've really been interested in figuring out how we can make sure that we're tackling the right problems in the right way and at the right time. And so as I think about the next steps, I'm paying attention to ways that I can particularly return to my roots and start thinking about ways to influence programs and policies. So in these next steps, I'm planning to focus more on not just traditional academic research that seeks to do this, but also these applied projects. And so I think of this in two forms. Traditional academic scholarship that's motivated by a goal to shape social policies for older adults, and then also research that directly addresses current issues facing older adults in the community. And my goal is to do a better job and create a model that helps work in partnership with those who work with older adults directly and with politicians and others to both guide the research that we need to be doing and also be involved in shaping those policy decisions.
So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Claudia SUEMOTO. I'm very happy to be here. I'm going to start doing my thanking my speech to thank everybody. So first of all, it's a great pleasure for me to be the recipient of the BUS Awards in the biomedical research for this year. It's a great honor. It was also a surprise for me. I was not expecting. And I'd like to start thanking Dr. Harvey, COHEN, and the Awards Committee for selecting me, and also the Duke University Center for the Study of Aging and Human Development that is supporting this award, and also the Gerontology International. And it's a pleasure to be receiving this award in the International Congress of Geriatrics and Gerontology. So besides this thanking, I also like to thank everybody that helped me to be here. It's a long journey. I finished my residence in geriatrics 22 years ago. And after that, I did a research career doing my PhD. And also I came back studying to also have a degree in epidemiology that I think was essential to perform all these studies. I did part of my training in the US. It was a great time to be there. I did my postdoctoral training. And I also would like to thank my mentors there, Professor Maria Glimmer and also Godard Dani. But my main, I'm most thankful to all the opportunities that I received when I came back to Brazil. As you saw in my presentations, there's a plenty of data in Brazil for us to analyze both the biobank for aging studies, the ELSA Brazil and the ELSA Brazil. And the data is there. But I was very fortunate to have wonderful collaborators. I cite many of them during my presentations, and also my students. Now we have more than 20 students working with us, from grad students, undergrads, and also postdoctoral students. So it's a great pleasure. And I think one thing that I would like to highlight before passing the word to Dr. CARR is that data is there. It's everywhere. It's also in Brazil, it's in Latin America, it's in the US, in Europe, it's everywhere. What we need is to have qualified people to analyze data and to extract meaningful results from that. And it's really, really important to have this kind of training in aging research. Aging is complex, it's multifactorial, and we need to have people that can handle data in an adequate manner. And also, I would like to stress that we need research in low middle income countries. As you saw in my presentation, we are very different. Unfortunately, have low socioeconomic status and diverse risk factors that need to be studied so we can understand aging in a broad sense. So that's it. Thanks so much. And I will pass the word to Dr. CARR.
Thank you so much. I too am very grateful for the opportunity to be given this award. I was also very surprised and extremely honored, and appreciate Dr. Cohen and the folks at Duke who were so generous in providing this award. And as mentioned in my talk, you know, the work that I presented, I tried to provide a little bit of an overview of the kinds of kind of big questions that have guided me so far, and those things are attributed to the communities of scholars that I've been able to interact with, and the large number of researchers who I consider mentors, colleagues, and now students who teach me. And adding to some of the comments that I think Claudia mentioned was in relation to kind of what we need to be seeing as a community of scholars, and that's coming together to solve big problems. And I think in order to solve these rather substantial problems, I think, that are facing older adults across the world, we need to be able to figure out what kinds of combinations of experts can work in interdisciplinary teams. And I think aging has a long history of doing that. And being able to figure out how to tackle these, both in terms of policy kinds of solutions at you know, looking at ways to work with policymakers, but also working with people in different fields of study so that we can identify different components that we can tackle. So with that, I think we have a couple of questions that we can answer. Do you want to go ahead and start, Claudia?
Sure. The first question, I think, is related to dementia. So Marcelino Andres asked, what caused a patient to be more aggressive than another in relation to their behavior with respect to dementia or Alzheimer's disease? Thanks so much, and Marcelino, that's a great question. I think there are two sides of the coin to answer these questions. First of all is environmental related. So I haven't seen a lot in patients and in my clinics that usually people don't get aggressive all of a sudden when they have dementia. They have a history during life. And more important than that, there is how the family handle the cognitive and neuropsychiatric symptoms. So we have very calm families that handle very well all the cognitive and psychological problems, and they go well. But also in our research in the brain bank, we have been doing correlations between what you see in the brain, the lesions, the location of the lesions, the type of protein that are accumulated, and the symptoms. So there is this very interesting work from Professor Lydia Greenberg and Alex Hirnberg from University of California, San Francisco, that they're doing in collaboration with us, that they show a clear relationship in Alzheimer's disease with the types of neuropsychiatric symptoms and the BRAC stage. BRAC stage is the accumulation of, represents the accumulation of neurofibrillary tangles. And in the beginning of the disease, when the disease is located more in the brain scene and also in the hippocampus, we have more apathy and also anxiety and depression. And then when the BRAC stage progresses, we have more advanced symptoms like aggression and agitation. So I think that there are both sides, both the pathologic correspondence between the symptoms and the neuropathology, but also how the person and the family handle the symptoms.
Great. There's a question that we received regarding the volunteering study that I referred to in my talk. And the question was related to differences with regard to the benefits of volunteering for men that differ from those that are experienced by women. And the question relates to why it is that men don't experience benefits unless they're volunteering at higher intensity levels. So the work that I did with my colleagues, Dr. Kale and Dr. Rowe, who you heard at the opening on this particular paper, this paper showed that men who volunteered for approximately 4 hours a week, it was 2 hours a week, I apologize, or more, experienced physical health benefits from volunteering, but not at lower intensity levels. The question is, why might that be true? And the reason that we often, or we pondered, although we can't know for certain, that it took a higher level of intensity, maybe the fact that men tend to accumulate fewer disabilities in later life than do women. Women tend to live longer with more levels of disability, but also women tend to have a lot of other social engagements. And so they're already accumulating some benefits from other social activities. And this may be why they experience those benefits. But for men who have fewer social activities, it may take a higher amount. So both they are already doing better than women in general, but also they have, on average, fewer other types of activities that they're engaging in. And so it takes more social and productive engagement to get to those physical health improvements. We had another question as well, I think I can briefly mention before we conclude here, related to the pandemic and resilience. And the question relates to ways that maybe the pandemic provided increased resilience for protection against isolation and loneliness. And the work that I've done here with colleagues sort of suggests that overall, actually, older adults in the United States experienced a decline in resilience during this period. And it is very likely the case that the loss of social engagements have contributed to that. So I think looking ahead, we hopefully will learn from this and figure out alternative pathways for maintaining social connections through even factors like this, where we can meet online and have wonderful conversations and help maintain those connections. So I think we're out of time. Thank you very much for having us, and again for this wonderful honor.
Thank you. Thanks so much.